Hello and good evening to this Wildlife for February from the Wildlife Trust. I'm Craig Bennett, I'm Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust and delighted to welcome you to this Wildlife this evening, looking at a very top topic that many people are talking about in Britain at the moment. You'll notice we're not on the road this month. We've come back to do one from our homes for once, but I mean it is fantastic to be out as Wildlife on the road and visiting around the country and also meeting you live audiences as we have done for many wildlives over the last few months. We've got many more of those planned, but it's February and it's a bit cold, so we're at home for this month, and I hope you understand that. But this evening we've got a great topic we're going to be talking about. We're asking ourselves, how can we build 1.5 million homes while solving the nature, climate and health crisis? Now, why have we chosen that topic? Of course, this was a pledge in the Labour manifesto before the last general election. The Labour said that if they became government, they would make sure that during the lifetime of that next parliament, that they would build 1.5 million homes. And this is a huge number, much bigger than any of the buildings of homes that we've had in recent years. We'll hear more about that. So, of course, it leads to quite a debate about what's the impact that's going to have on the environment. Can our water tables take it? Can nature take it? Do we build these homes just try and build them as quickly and cheaply as possible, or do we build them in a nature positive way? And we'll find out more what that means during the course of this evening. Broadly, at the Wildlife Trust, we do believe that we need to be building new houses in this country. There's a big debate over how many. There's a big debate about where. There's a big debate about what form they should take, and so on. And we want to get into that tonight. So it's not just a debate whether we need new houses or not. We're trying to get into some of the details of it as well. And my goodness, this has proved popular. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of you have signed up in advance to watch live tonight. And that means thousands and thousands of people will watch this on catch up in the next few days. But the most astonishing thing is we've had over 200 questions submitted before we even start tonight from you as the audience wanting to ask questions about this. So let's get underway. It's a big topic to cover. Do let us know in the chat where you're watching from tonight, and do make sure you put in questions in the chat and comments as well. Just keep it friendly, please, and nice. It's a big topic to cover. We do have a fantastic panel to help us through this issue tonight. We have Dr. Ada Lee, who's policy specialist with the Royal Town Planning Institute. We have Venus Galarza-Mullins, who's policy manager at Shelter. We have Sarah Jane Chimbwandira, who's chief executive at Surrey Wildlife Trusts, and we have Ed Lockhart, who's chief executive at the Future Homes Hub. Big welcome to all the fellow panelists tonight who will help us through this, and thank you very much for taking time to join us tonight. So I'll start with you, Ada, if I can. Dr. Ada Lee, policy specialist at the Royal Town Planning Institute. Ada, tell us a little bit more, first of all, about the Royal Town Planning Institute. What is it, and what's some of the work you do, particularly around this issue of housing?
Right. First of all, thank you very much for having me tonight. Really pleased to be here. So the RTPI is the Royal Town Planning Institute. We are the professional body for planners. We have 27,000 members, mostly based in the UK, but we also have quite a lot of international members as well. We advocate for good planning, and we also set standards for planning education and the profession.
Fantastic. And so, Ada, tell us a little bit more. Let's just go back to basics here at the moment. The Labour Party said in opposition that we need to build 1.5 million homes during the lifetime of this Parliament. Can you tell us a bit more? Where does that figure 1.5 million come from? I mean, is there evidence that we actually do need 1.5 million new homes in this country?
I think when we looked at, during the general election period, when we looked at the pledges of different political parties, I think like most of them basically came up with a very similar ballpark. So I think it is definitely recognized that there's a housing crisis at the moment in this country. But I suppose, as the title of this show suggested, we're also facing a nature crisis, climate crisis, and also there are also questions on how we can improve health as well. So so we have a housing crisis to solve. I don't think that's anything up for contention. We don't really have a view on whether 1.5 is the correct number. It is a target. We are supportive of the government's ambition to solve the housing crisis.
Okay, good. Okay, well, we'll get into this a little bit more. I mean, obviously, I said that we had loads of questions in advance of tonight. One of them came from Gareth Ridgewood, who said, is a lack of joined up regional scale spatial strategic planning the real blocker to growth and not nature? How can we put nature at the heart of growth, creating places people want to live, businesses want to invest in, nature recover, and countryside thrive? I mean, this is obviously what we're going to be talking about all evening, but why don't you kick us off, Ada? What's your view on that?
Yeah, sure. A recent research report by the RTPI shows that strategic planning or regional planning in England is very fragmented at the moment. So we haven't had formal strategic planning for a very, very long time. Now, this government has committed to reintroducing strategic planning, and we are going to see new strategic authorities being established. We're going to see spatial development strategies across England, hopefully by the end of this parliament. So there's definitely work being done on this front, and we are very, very supportive of this work. And I think like proper strategic planning isn't only conducive to growth, but also to nature, to environmental protection in general as well. So as for the question of how we can make nature the heart of growth, again, like strategic planning will have a very important role to play. And looking more broadly, local nature recovery strategies is a very, very good place to start. But the problem with all these environmental plans, strategies, and targets is that at the moment, they sort of work in silos. So if you look at how a planner works, like they might have to look at like almost a dozen of different environmental obligations, plans, strategies in their daily work. So there's definitely scope to sort of take a more holistic approach to nature recovery, to environmental protection, so that, it's not only about habitats, it's not only about water, but how all these things come together. And there's the question of climate change as well, which at the moment, a lot of the environmental plans and strategies don't properly take into account.
Yeah, I'll come on to that in just a second. But Ada, what's quite interesting about this is a lot of the commentary we get at the moment from politicians, from commentators, and so on, is they really do have a go at planning for everything. I mean, it's I was at the Labour Party conference last October, and honestly, everywhere you went, the discussion was the problem is planning, too much planning. We've got to change the planning system. Almost like when you were stuck in a queue to try and get a cup of coffee, you thought the person in front of you going to say the problem was the queue was too much planning or something. It was quite extraordinary. But really, in many respects, what you're saying there is we almost don't have enough planning, perhaps at a different level, perhaps at a strategic level, there's not enough planning. So there's one thing, you've got local planning, but we don't have planning operating at that strategic level.
Well, yes, we definitely need to stop seeing planning as a blocker to everything. Basically the role of planning is to mediate between different interests, different concerns, so that we can achieve the best outcomes possible. I would say, like, is there enough planning? Possibly not, but I think the more, going into the core of the problem is that we don't have enough resourcing for planning. So we don't necessarily need to create, well, obviously strategic planning is a great thing, but we don't necessarily need to create more procedures, more planning duties, etc. What we need is really proper resourcing to the system so that planners can do their work properly.
Okay, thank you. And a couple of other things, Ada. There's obviously, it's often talked about, it's long been quoted that actually planning permission exists today to be built. And yet, the political debate is all about how we've got to get rid of the planning system or simplify the planning system to allow more planning applications to get through. From your point of view, what is this problem about the fact that planning permission exists for 1 million new homes to be built, but they're not being built? Why is that, to your mind?
I think the heart of this problem is that planning is only about consenting, right? We can give out as many permissions as, as appropriate, but then at the end of the day, there's the wider building industry as well that is facing a range of other challenges as well, like shortages, like staff shortages in the building industry is one, supply chain is another, and ultimately planning works within a system that is set by the government. So there's only so much planning can solve. But on the point about streamlining and making things go faster, there's also the question of there's times being spent on approving planning applications. And we need to think about whether that is time well spent. And I would argue that a lot of time it is, because again, going back to my previous point about how planning is about mediating between different interests. And very often we really do need to have, that time to, to be able to find the best solutions for a particular situation. So, yeah, so I would say that instead of always trying to streamline planning, make things go faster, a better framing of this would be proportionality. So whether we are actually putting in like a good amount of time on a certain process of planning rather than blindly trying to go after speed.
Great, Ada, thank you very much. Well, there's going to be so much more to talk about as we get into this tonight. But Ada, I just want to ask if you can set us up for one more thing. We're about to go into a little video to talk about biodiversity net gain. And I wonder if you can just do a brief introduction to what biodiversity net gain is, because that's going to come up a little bit tonight as well.
Yeah, so biodiversity net gain is a new obligation for developers to, I can't remember the exact figures, it's like to provide 10% of biodiversity net gain in their development. So there's been several research published quite recently about how that target might not, targets basically not being met, and particularly at the University of Sheffield, researchers have found that more generally planning conditions to improve nature basically haven't worked that well because of a lack of monitoring and enforcement, but I'm sure we can come back to that later.
Absolutely. Okay, well, biodiversity net gain is a phrase that you might have heard being talked about quite a lot over the last year or so. And it is that requirement, as Ada says, that when new developments are made, they produce new space for biodiversity. It can get quite complicated, but at the Wildlife Trust, we're trying to explain it as simply as possible. So here's a little video that we've put together to explain what is biodiversity net gain.
I'm Phoebe and I'm the Green Finance Manager at the Wildlife Trust. Wildlife trusts across England are working with developers to deliver biodiversity net gain, or BNG. Today I'm at Wild Whittington in Derbyshire, which is one of the sites where we're working with developers to deliver biodiversity net gain. Biodiversity net gain is a mandatory approach to planning development in England, which means developers must deliver a 10% gain in biodiversity. This means developers must deliver a measurable improvement to nature by enhancing or creating new habitats, hedgerows or watercourses and managing these for at least 30 years. Developers must follow a series of steps that seek to avoid and minimise impacts to biodiversity. The first step is to avoid damage and then look to enhance existing habitats on the site of their development. This is where wildlife trusts or their consultancies are working with developers to support them with surveys, impact assessments or biodiversity net gain delivery plans to help them deliver nature on their sites.
I'm Jessica Lewis, Head of Sustainable Places for Berkeley Group, which means that I look after our nature and community strategies. Today we are at Kidbrooke Village, which is on the former Ferrier estate. Berkeley are delivering 5,000 homes here. It's great to work with the Wildlife Trust because they have that expertise and insight and can really advise us on the design at that pre-application and planning stage, and that's really beneficial to us, and it means that we create more biodiverse places that people can enjoy. They do challenge us and push us to get the best out of a development. And here at Kidbrooke, we're looking to achieve a 250% net gain. In the future, we will be working with the London Wildlife Trust to carry out surveys of birds and invertebrates, as well as checking our baseline and our overall BMG against that baseline.
There we are, a little description of biodiversity net gain, and we'll be telling you a little bit more about it a little bit later in this Wildlife. I want to go next to Ed Lockhart, if I can. Ed, thanks so much for joining us tonight. You're with the Future Homes Hub. Tell us a little bit more about the Future Homes Hub.
Thanks very much, Craig, and very good to be here. So the Future Homes Hub is an organisation that was set up about 3.5 years ago to bring the home building community together to meet government's targets for climate and environment. So we're a membership organisation. We have about 160 members, about 80 home builder members. So all of the largest home builders, but then a cross section of small, medium and smaller sized home builders as well. And our goal is really to meet those long-term targets for home building. But what we do is to work out a long-term plan for how the sector can meet those targets. We work on the policies. We work on how to implement the policies. We work on the solutions on the ground. A particular thing for the Future Homes Hub is to support the smaller developers as well. But really, we're here to sort of help work out how we can build nature positive homes at scale.
Well, let's hear a little bit more about that. And one of the questions we got in advance, Ed, was from Colleen Eccles. She said, examples such as Kidbrooke development in London, that's in South London, brilliant development I've been to, really impressive, show how developers, that's Berkeley Homes in that case, are working with Wildlife Trust, this is London Wildlife Trust, using biodiversity net gain, how they can provide improved spaces for nature while providing quality vertical homes. She asked, what other alternative design examples do you see as exemplars, maybe without such vertical concentration and with affordable options designed in? I mean, I think Kidbrooke does have affordable homes part of it, I seem to recall, and it's not necessarily what I would call high-rise, Colleen, but well, it's all relative, isn't it? It's all relative. But Ed, give us a feel of what are some of the developments being produced by your members over the last few years that create that extra space, more space for nature in and around the development. What sort of range of design approaches that have been developed?
And so this is something particularly triggered by biodiversity net gain. Everyone's thinking about how can we build developments that really incorporate nature in from the start. And I'm just thinking the last sort of 3 or 4 developments. One of the best parts of my job is actually going out and seeing developments being built and having been built and just getting a sense of what developments look like nowadays. And it's really impressive how developers are incorporating nature right from the start of design and really building around the natural environment that's there. So, I mean, obviously Berkeley's a great example with Kidbrooke, but now I'd say the last companies I've been out to are companies like Thacum and Gleeson and Crowdace and Hayfield. So, you know, a number of different, and they're all building low rise rather than taller buildings. And they're all, you know, incorporating nature from the start. They're building nature friendly, sustainable urban drainage schemes. And some of these developers are, so Gleeson, for example, intentionally builds for the minimum wage. So these are, you know, houses that are accessible to low-income families as well, and they're really sort of trying to incorporate biodiversity from the start. Now, obviously, this is mandatory, so everyone's going to be doing it. But I think the other thing, and you may have got the impression from the video. So Jessica Lewis at Berkeley, we work with very closely. One of the cultural shifts we've seen in home builders recently is everyone hiring ecologists. So, you know, cast back 5 or 10 years ago, you didn't have ecologists, professional ecologists in many home builders. Part of the cultural shift is that everyone has them, and there's real pride in you know, amongst that community and more broadly across home builders in what they're doing and what they're able to do. So I think, you know, the culture is shifting as well as the law and enforcement and other things alongside that.
Well, Ed, it won't surprise you that obviously there are some questions that sort of come about trust in all of this. One of the questions we had in advance was from Andrew Urquhart. He said, can we trust any biodiversity net gain claims from developers? Surveys of completed houses show that less than half of simple measures such as Swift bricks boxes are missing. If developers can't even be trusted to install these, how can we have any confidence in promises of habitat gain? Michelle Thomason asked, how can local planning authorities and councils ensure that biodiversity net gain agreements are upheld over time when they are already short of resources and personnel and have outsourced their environmental teams to landscape contractors? I mean, as a Wildlife Trust, we estimate that only 1 in 4 local authorities actually have an ecologist on staff. So, Ed, what would you say to that? There is an issue here, isn't it, about, you know, the home builders need to do quite a lot to build trust here amongst the public that they will deliver biodiversity net gain and deliver it well, and indeed that the resources will be there amongst local authorities to ensure that happens.
Absolutely, and I think Ada put her finger on it in talking, you know, particularly about, I think was it Sheffield University report and you know, some of these measures not having been delivered in the past, and that really being a problem around monitoring and enforcement. And the monitoring and enforcement hasn't been there, and that, you know, that leads to a perhaps you know, a poor culture of people putting in measures and over a period of time not expect, or you know, being required to in conditions, and over a period of time you know, that it's sort of become accepted that they don't actually do it. Now, biodiversity net gain is very different. Obviously, it's a law. It's accompanied by monitoring and enforcement, and so I would draw a line in the sand from some of that experience in the past to what we will now see with biodiversity net gain, because of the legal nature of it, because of the systems around it. But I still don't think we can take that for granted. So I do think we need collectively, and this is, you know, partnership working with the Wildlife Trust, with other organisations, to make sure that we do have the right monitoring in place, and that there are the right resources in local authorities. So I do think, you know, I think the sector as a community, we need to earn the trust of the public and make sure collectively that we do have the monitoring in place, that you know, people don't get away with not putting these measures in place. Another thing that we're doing as the Future Homes Hub alongside biodiversity net gain is an initiative called Homes for Nature, and where home builders are committing to install Swift bricks now and hedgehog highways and other nature friendly sort of on-site measures, and that is accompanied by very robust monitoring and reporting. So, you know, we're tracking that, you know, in terms of sort of what home builders are actually doing. So I think that those kind of mechanisms are absolutely essential alongside, you know, the basic requirement or the basic commitment.
And it is would you say that the home builders are committed to delivering biodiversity net gain? I mean, it's obviously a legal requirement, but there's been some scary reporting the last week, albeit in the more specialist journals like the ENDS report, that actually Keir Starmer's getting a bit wobbly on it, that he's had lobbying from some of the developers to get rid of biodiversity net gain. This is something we really worry about, the Wildlife Trust, because at this stage, millions of pounds has been invested in delivering biodiversity net gain. It would be pretty appalling to suddenly get rid of it now, wouldn't it? It would upset everything.
So look, I think biodiversity net gain is a real win-win. It's a win for homes, for people, for nature, and you know, in principle, it's a fantastic policy, and collectively we need to make sure that it works. Now, when biodiversity net gain was introduced, the home building community very much welcomed it. And you know, we put out videos, and you know, and I think there was, you know, all home builders, you know, across the piece, certainly all our members really welcomed it. Now, it's not to say there haven't been challenges, teething problems, that kind of thing, but I think our focus needs to be on solving those, working together to solve those. So we've set up something called the Biodiversity Net Gain Implementation Board to bring stakeholders together to identify where there are teething problems and to resolve them. Now, I've also heard you know, some you know, calls for, you know, is this policy working? Should we, you know, should we scrap it? I think the attention is more around smaller sites, and my perception is that it's a small number of you know, smaller home builders that are saying that. So if and we're beginning to get the data and the stats, and the vast majority, even of smaller site applications, are working really well. I think there are, a small some few examples where, there are problems. Sometimes it's problems in terms of people not having the right information. Sometimes maybe tweaks needed to the policy. But I think, we need somehow to avoid the, just a few smaller voices, appearing louder perhaps in Westminster, because I think, my perception talking to home builders across the piece is that people see this as a real win-win as a policy, and I think home builders are proud when they build good, green, nature-friendly development, and that's something we should all encourage.
So I know Keir Starmer never misses a wildlife. Your message to him is really clear. Don't go chopping and changing biodiversity net gain right now. Let's get on and deliver it. And yeah, there might be a bit of ironing out the creases, but let's get on and deliver it.
Yep, that's it.
Great, thank you very much. We'll clip that bit. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you in a little while. Let's move on now to Venus Galarza-Mullins from Shelter. Venus, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and fantastic organisation that Shelter is. I mean, you bring some real clarity to this. So thank you. But do tell us. I mean, I'm sure people are very familiar with Shelter, but tell us, give us your little normal introduction to Shelter in case people don't know.
Of course, yeah, thank you for having me. So Shelter, I hope many people know, is a housing and homelessness charity. We provide advice and legal services on housing rights, including to people who are homeless or at risk at homeless, and who also are just having trouble with their trouble with housing issues. We are also a campaign organization, so we do a lot of work around what needs to change to end the housing emergency and end homelessness as well.
Great. So Venus, I mean, I think there's no one that wants to see people homeless in this country. There's no one wants to people know that it's very hard for young people to get new homes and so on, that there is a housing crisis. I think everyone accepts that. But so much of the debate at the moment is really quite simplistic, isn't it? Oh, we've just got to build. Got to build new homes, 1.5 million homes. Help us through this. I mean, just in the last week alone, I saw an article in the Financial Times that said that just last October, it's thought that there were 700,000 empty properties in this country, hundreds of thousands of dilapidated properties that could be fixed up. Derelict homes and so on. There is supposedly that the planning permissions that exist tonight to build 1 million new homes. Ask you a very simple but huge question: why is there a housing crisis? What's going on? And what do we need to do to fix it?
Yeah, so I think there is a housing emergency, obviously, as you just said. So Shelter believes that the delivery of 90,000 social rent homes a year for 10 years is not only the answer to the housing emergency and homelessness, but also to the environmental emergencies and climate change problems that we are seeing and the impact on homes. It's also good for the economy and people's quality of life and well-being. We know nature and access to open space and outdoor space is extremely important, especially I think that realization really hit home, no pun intended, during COVID, right? When we saw how important it was to have that open space, to have access to nature, and that was really important. For us, the housing emergency is caused by not having enough social rent homes. The number of homes that we have lost in the last decade has been over 260,000 social rent homes due to sales, demolitions, and conversions actually to other tenures. So that, with the lack of investment year to year, every affordable homes program has really caused a major problem. We're seeing skyrocketing rents in the private renters sector, poor quality conditions, and people just need more social rent homes that they can actually afford, genuinely affordable homes. I think often people are looking at the national target, right? This the 1.5 million homes, but we're not necessarily, or I'm hoping that now that is now changing more and more. To the government's credit, they are raising and amplifying the messages around social rent specifically and about an affordable housing targets. But for so long, it has always been about the number of homes as opposed to the type of homes, where the homes are going to be built, and if they're going to be generally affordable. I think there's been a massive concentration and effort by previous governments to focus on home ownership. But as we know, many households and families do not have a savings for a deposit. Many can't get a mortgage, so they're stuck. They're stuck in a vicious cycle of not being able to have a decent, affordable home. And we think that the answer is social. I think often also people view the delivery of a mass scale social house building program as counter to an environmental agenda or to the climate change or a net zero agenda. But in fact, the two are very much connected. I hope most people can see that. Again, there's 1.3 million households on the social housing waitlist. That's over 160,000 children who are experiencing homelessness, and many are living in overcrowded and poor quality condition homes with damp and mold. And so this is also about climate justice and how the housing and climate emergencies also affect lower income households and communities of color. We know that about a quarter of private renters have cut back on energy in the last month to keep up with rent payments. We know there's also a racial equality argument to this as well. Most people of color are mostly affected by the housing emergency as well as the climate and environmental emergencies, and they more likely to experience fuel poverty. And again, access to green space is good for people's physical health and well-being, and yet most Black persons are likely not to have access to that green space or to nature. So really, these two things can go hand in hand when we're thinking about what we're building, where we're building. To answer your question on empty homes, it's a question Shelter gets asked quite a lot. Do we actually need to build 90,000 new social homes? And I think the answer is yes, we do need to build, as you said earlier in the opening remarks, Craig. But the biggest thing is that not every empty home is suitable for the households that are in temporary accommodation, that are waiting for a new home. Some of them do not have access to health or education facilities. Some of them would be extremely difficult because they're in transportation deserts. So unfortunately, not every empty home could just be retrofitted, and we can definitely, just pick up from there. We definitely need to have a much larger housing strategy that takes into account, yes, some empty homes, but also incorporates new builds and making sure those new builds are sustainable.
Amazing, fantastic. And for what it's worth, Venus, I think there's hardly anyone across the Wildlife Trust that would disagree with anything you just said there. Absolutely. But let's just dig into it a little bit, because there are some interesting things you say there. Just to be really clear, what's your definition of social home? So when you talk about social homes, what makes a home social home or not a social home?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I should have opened up with that. I think often we hear affordable housing, and that can be conflated with generally affordable homes like social rent homes. So at Shelter, we are campaigning and we are pushing the government to invest in social rent homes, which are linked to local income. So obviously, that is a big part of it. Generally, you can find social rent homes will most likely fit the market between 50 to 60% of the market rate. That larger umbrella term of affordable housing can be up to 80% of the market rate, which then always begs the question, affordable to who? What communities can possibly afford that? Many people cannot. Many people on the social housing waitlist cannot. So yes, we are specifically calling for social homes because that to us is the only generally affordable type of home.
Fascinating. But it's worth saying that when you talk about 90,000 social homes, I mean, that's a lot less than the government's 1.5 million figure of new homes over the lifetime of this parliament, which equates to something like 300,000 homes a year. Yeah. You're talking about 90,000 social homes a year. So what's Shelter's position about, do we need to build 300,000 homes a year, or should we just focus on the 90,000 social homes and just see what the market does on the other? What's your view on that?
Yeah, so at Shelter, we do recognize that obviously mixed tenure communities are always great, right? For our societies, for our communities, having a mix of home ownership, having a mix of other types of affordable homes. But social rent, as I mentioned before, has been so deprioritized, not only by the government, but also private developers as well. Yeah. And so that's why our focus is on social homes, because the other types of homes have already have campaigns for them. They're already prioritized type of home for the government and for developers, mostly because of profit, but also because of speculative development and how our housing system works. So yes, 90,000, right, in comparison, 90,000 social rent homes a year for 10 years is less than what the government is putting out with their overall target, but we do feel that there has to be mixed tenures. So yes, some of those other types of tenures do have to come in, but we have to have a priority focus and government investment specifically on social rent homes.
And you said the government is changing its rhetoric a little bit. What is it now? I've not picked that up so much myself yet. I still hear them talking about 1.5 million homes a lot. Tell us how they're changing their rhetoric.
Yeah, I think some solid examples that we quite welcomed were I know the latest NPPF changes in December was not to everybody's liking, but it was the first time that we actually saw social rent specifically mentioned. So it wasn't just having affordable housing constantly repeated throughout the document. It was also making sure that it said affordable and social rent. There are other lines in the NPPF that specifically say that local authorities must give weight and consideration to the need of social rent as well. And even if you look at something so simple like the annex, it is very distinctly now separated, right? You have what affordable housing is in the definition, and you also have social rent. I think recently, some of the announcements on top up for the affordable homes program, the current round that we are in, that also made mention to social rent, but even other lines that they've mentioned about wanting to deliver the most affordable and social rent homes in a generation. So again, making sure that there's this distinction and that they're at least in language putting that, making sure that those two things are being more decoupled in the rhetoric, in the language. So hopefully that will translate to when a new affordable homes program is announced, that we will see a focus specifically on social rent and not just an umbrella sort of target with affordable housing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Venus. And then final comment I just want to ask you is who should build these 90,000 social homes? Because one of the interesting things, isn't it, whenever this country has really succeeded in building anything like, you know, social homes in big numbers or 300,000 homes a year, even if you're talking mixed tenure and so on, actually it's nearly always when the state or the public sector has got rolled their sleeves up and done a lot of the building. What's your view at Shelter as to who should be building these? And
yeah, we think the government needs to lead with a mass scale building program. So making sure that investment is there, and the best way to do that, the most direct lever that they can pull is a new affordable homes program, which has not been announced yet. Hopefully that does get announced. Shelter is hoping now in June with the spending review. So we do think the government needs to lead that directive and to set expectations in the new affordable homes program or whatever the successor is. Additionally, we think developers need to build their fair share of social rent homes as well. We know that even though there are affordable housing thresholds in local authorities, that oftentimes viability loopholes do come in and social rent homes are deprioritized in what gets built, either whether it's offsite or it's commuted and you know, not built to a much later time. So we do think those homes need to kind of be embedded in every scheme that gets put forward, that there is at least a minimum social rent that cannot be kind of wiggled out of, which we do often see too much. And so at Shelter, actually, we think even a 20% national minimum target for all developments over 10 homes or more should be for social rent. Obviously, if local authorities and local areas wanted to do more, that's fantastic. But at least let's set a baseline and a target so that we're making sure that developers are doing their fair share as well.
brilliant, Venus. Well, you know, it's so good to hear what you're saying tonight. It does feel like you're bringing a lot of sense to this debate right now. This focus on social homes, if actually the issue is around trying to solve the housing emergency, you know, clearly it would seem obvious that that's kind of where you start for sure. So thank you, Venus, very much for that, and we're looking forward to getting into the Q&A with you. Now, Venus was talking there, of course, about how important access to nature is for everyone in society, including actually particularly the poorest in society, and recognizing that at the moment we don't see equality in the way people can have access to nature, whether we're talking about around income levels, around ethnicity, or whatever. And we were talking also earlier about this new policy of biodiversity net gain, which, although there have been one or two rumours recently about perhaps the Prime Minister not liking it, actually, we are pleased to say that we keep being told by the government that they are committed to it. There was a planning document produced by the government just last month that said in black and white that this government is committed to biodiversity net gain and to delivering it. So let's find out a little bit more about biodiversity net gain with our second video tonight, explaining BNG, second video from the Wildlife Trusts.
If developers can't deliver all of their biodiversity on site, they can look to deliver it off-site through dedicated habitat banks. Wildlife trusts across England are creating habitat banks to sell biodiversity net gain units. In this way, we're directly financing nature's recovery by creating new sites that strategically support wider, bigger picture landscape recovery projects.
So I'm Emmanuel Deschamps. I'm a Sustainability Director for Howell Campus, where we are today, the UK's leading science and innovation campus. We have a huge pipeline of development to bring more homes for scientists and organizations, which leads to an impact on biodiversity, really, and some biodiversity losses that we're really trying to minimize as much as possible. Working with the Wildlife Trust for us is really exciting. That's an organization that is recognized for its efforts on nature conservation. So for us, it's really exciting to be part of this journey on Howell Campus. We want science to happen here for hundreds of years to come. And when we look for biodiversity units provider or biodiversity unit site, we really want something that match this ambition. We want sites that will be maintained beyond 30 years. We want that sort of guarantee so that the investment, the financial contribution we make will really make a difference in the long term and not just to meet legal requirements.
The land that we acquire will always be additional. Because they're being used to offset development that is going to be taking land away from nature and people, we're really passionate that our habitat banks are providing more land, new land for nature and people.
It really is a long-term funding mechanism, and it will release additional resilient funding streams to our charity.
A number of wildlife trusts across England are also now registered responsible bodies, which means they're working with landowners and other organisations to secure high-quality off-site biodiversity net gain. The Wildlife Trust work on biodiversity net gain is helping to create enjoyable biodiverse areas for people to live and work. Through the sale of off-site biodiversity net gain units, we're helping to fund newly created and protected habitats.
Welcome back. Really hope you found those videos useful. So joining us next is Sarah Jane from the Chief Exec of Surrey Wildlife Trust. Sarah Jane, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And Sarah, obviously people will know all about the Wildlife Trust, but tell us a little bit more. Why have we asked you in particular, Surrey Wildlife Trust, to join this panel discussion tonight? Or at least why do you think we have?
I think it's been really interesting listening to the conversation this evening, actually. And Surrey Wildlife Trust, one of 46 wildlife trusts nationally, we are all about our local places. And one of the things that we haven't spoken about very much so far is the placemaking aspect of what we're talking about. So it is about how do we stop thinking about outcomes in isolation. So we don't think about economic outcomes or societal outcomes in isolation, but we think about those as part of creating high quality places for people to live. And as a local wildlife trust, we have the opportunity to really focus on creating those local places for people, but within the federated movement that allows us to really think about that national and regional picture as well. And I really welcome the comments earlier from Ada about the regional planning piece, because I think that is very important. But if you want to take Surrey as an example, Surrey's quite an interesting county. It's the third smallest county in the country. Lots of people don't know that, but it has 2 international airports, one on either side. It has over 100 major corporate headquarters. It has over 65,000 SMEs in the county, but it also has over 70 sites of special scientific interest and 2 national nature reserves. So it's an absolute microcosm of this debate that we're having about how do we create high quality places, particularly for our younger generations, to be able to afford to live in high quality places with access to good quality nature. Surrey as a county has less than 25% of its green space available for people to walk to from their front door. So if you want to go out to many of these beautiful sites that we have, you've got to get in a car and drive there. So again, from the social justice perspective that Venus was talking about earlier, there's a real opportunity for us here to think about how we use land to create these high quality places for people to live and work in.
Great, Sarah Jane. Yeah, got a lot to think about there. Now, obviously, the debate as it's been going over the last few months has started to get quite spicy at times. I mean, we've had Susan Jones said to us, reminded us this evening before we actually started. She said, Angela Rayner has said that they can't have a situation where a newt is more protected than people who desperately need housing. To what extent are they going to ignore wildlife? I mean, I hope you impressed that it took me almost 50 minutes before I mentioned the word newt or bats, which we seem to have to deal with quite a lot at the moment. But Sarah Jane, it is extraordinary, isn't it? Suddenly bats and newts seem to be completely absorbing a lot of the discussion around this debate. You know, why is that? And what do we as the Wildlife Trust think about this?
I think one of the challenges that we have today is that there are a lot of crises that we're dealing with. We've heard about, you know, the crises that Venus was talking about for people finding housing, but also the climate and nature crisis that obviously we're talking about. And so we have some really complex challenges that we're facing as a society. And I think that sometimes it feels easier to create a false dichotomy when you are talking about complex challenges and talking about changing some of the systems that are locking us into these sort of dichotomies, rather than actually thinking about how do we provide multiple solutions. So one of the challenges that we have is we want to make a lot of use of a relatively small amount of land that we have. Hugely welcome the land use framework consultation that's come out at the moment, because I think we need to have a really serious and sensible and a very transparent discussion about the trade-offs that we need to make with our land use. So we want to do lots of different things, many of which are very, very legitimate things to do. We can't do all of those things 100%, but maybe we can do most of those things to 80%. The only way we're going to achieve that is if we get into a room together, have early conversations about how we make that happen, and everybody is willing to recognise that natural infrastructure is just as integral to this as energy, water, transport, all of the other infrastructures which are accepted as part of the discussion.
Absolutely. And Sarah Jane, we've also been talking tonight about biodiversity net gain. You've just been talking about it as well, but also how we as the Wildlife Trust see ourselves as one of the sort of main delivery agents of delivering biodiversity net gain. But, you know, we did have a question that said, how can the Wildlife Trust be trusted to take an impartial view on new development proposals if they're set to gain through schemes like biodiversity net gain? Shouldn't the Wildlife Trust focus on making sure places good for nature aren't developed on? What's your sense of that?
So again, I think, you know, biodiversity net gain is a really interesting tool available to us. We've talked about it a lot this evening. We need to remember that actually biodiversity net gain is replacing a system in the past that really didn't work for nature. So although it might have had its teething problems, we're only a year in to the mandatory scheme. I think most reasonable people would actually say that a year is not a very long time. You've got teething problems that you need to work through. But I would sort of come back to this point about the best outcomes for all of us will be when we knit all of the needs that we have of the land that we have together, so that we don't create this false dichotomy between creating nature through biodiversity net gain. Wildlife trusts are inherently, as organisations, invested in the mission of delivering nature recovery. That's what we're here to do. And I think in most cases, we are trusted organisations to do that. In Surrey, we are very keen to make sure that we not only deliver biodiversity net gain through our own sites, but we also support other landowners to deliver biodiversity net gain on their land as well. So we take very much a test and learn approach on our own land, so that we are not competitive with other landowners who can also deliver nature on their own land through biodiversity net gain. I think from my perspective, it's also really important to recognise that biodiversity net gain is only one investment mechanism in achieving nature recovery, and it's only probably a relatively overall small investment mechanism. And it's important that we don't forget that there are other things that we need to do. So in Surrey, we've worked with our local planning authorities to encourage them towards a 20% minimum biodiversity net gain. And we have 3 local authorities in the county who are doing that, because actually a 20% minimum biodiversity net gain allows us to create investment in local nature recovery networks, for example, and go that little bit further in terms of achieving nature recovery outside of the development envelope.
Great, Sarah Jane, thank you very much. There's a lot to think about there, and there's been a lot of questions and comments coming in this evening. I'm just going to, for your benefit and for the panel's benefit, just give you a little bit of flavour of them. Susan Doxat has said, don't you agree every little helps? Green roofs, living walls, bridges and tunnels for wildlife and more natural gardens, natural grass, play and sports areas. Andrew Dyke has said, how can we build more and solve the sewage pollution question? Plus, it is predicted that the UK will run out of water for drinking purposes by 2050. Elizabeth Susans says, how can we make better use of brownfield sites? Auntie Lamb has said, how do developers consider the use of local materials such as straw bales or rammed earth as part of the scheme? Joe Stott has asked an important technical question, but how quickly could the government's proposed nature restoration fund delivery plans become a physical reality and begin delivering large-scale habitat benefits for nature? So in short, this cuts to the sort of bats and newts question. It's about trying to take a more strategic approach, about trying to create more space for nature in a way that means everything can be speeded up around building, and the sort of habitat compensation is done before individual bats and newts and so on are found, and things like that, and to build more strategic compensation, habitat compensation as well. The government's currently got a consultation on that. In terms of Joe's question, how quickly can it do it? I don't know. That's a question for Whitehall, I think, Joe, I'm afraid. Joanna Herbert Stepney has said a very pithy phrase, but I think it kind of sums up in an answer to the key question tonight: can we build 1.5 million homes in a way that helps solve the nature, climate and social crisis? She says it's not impossible, but obviously can be done badly or less badly, which I think kind of sums it up. We've had many more questions coming in tonight. Judith did ask the question, what's the difference between social rent homes and council houses? I think you might have dealt with that a bit, Venus, but you might want to pick that up. MJ Cousins, Matt, has said, as well as Swift bricks to be incorporated in home building, are B bricks to be included as well. Nice thought there as well. So let's kind of get into this a little bit more with some of those kind of questions there. Venus, I'll come back to you because you've been hearing from all those kind of, and that's just a tiny handful of hundreds and hundreds of questions and comments that have come in tonight. You know, it's obviously really encouraging, and I think two organisations like the Wildlife Trust and Shelter find ourselves really quite aligned in many respects on what we want to deliver here. Perhaps historically, a lot of people might not thought the Wildlife Trust would necessarily be out there talking about the need for new housing, or indeed that Shelter would be out there talking about the need for nature in developments. It's an interesting kind of coming together on the agenda, isn't it? How much do you think that's actually kind of cut through to the mainstream yet? Because a lot of the political and media debate seems to be still this kind of rather binary debate.
Yeah, I was just as you were saying that, I was thinking that of yeah, who would thought that wildlife would be saying we need more social rent homes, and Shelter obviously saying yes, there's a climate emergency and there's an issue there. Totally agree on that front. I don't think it's really cut through yet, that you can do both, that both things are connected. I think even within the sector, it's something that it is much easier, I think, as Sarah said, to create opposition between two very, very important things, right? When you look at homes versus nature, or even private versus social rent homes, or all of those things, I think sometimes it's much easier to say, well, we have to pick one or the other, as opposed to trying to think about what policy interventions can fit both crises and how do we actually address that. I'm hoping that the more and more like organizations like Shelter and the Wildlife Trust and others can kind of see that this is a much holistic, systemic problem that we all need to kind of deal with and come up with solutions together, that hopefully the media, in government, and others will kind of pick it up and kind of realize that the same things we're coming to terms with.
Absolutely. And Ed, I'll come back to you if I can. One of the questions there was a question I find really interesting about the use of built materials. We've talked about the design here and incorporating how we can incorporate nature in the design, but actually the materials that are used for building new houses, and how to make those more sustainable. There's talk there about straw bales and rammed earth and so on. But I mean, even just making use of sustainable timber rather than necessarily concrete, or different types of concrete, some that actually absorb carbon now. There's an awful lot been happening in innovation around building materials in the last few years, isn't there?
I must say I'm not an expert in building materials, but I would say that, like, in planning terms, there are definitely things that we can do to minimize sort of how much carbon we are emitting when we're building new communities. So, for example, the RDPI's research report on location of development shows that, basically in the last decade, there have been quite a lot of missed opportunities in terms of building like more connected neighborhoods, so that people can walk to places, walk to school, walk to GPs, etc. So obviously recognize that the built environment industry is a large carbon emitter, but there's absolutely things that we can do to limit how much carbon we emit.
Absolutely. And Ed, what about you at Future Homes Hub? You must have been giving quite a lot of thought to this around the building materials.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the main areas we look at is climate change and energy, and obviously there's a big focus on reducing the emissions when the house is actually being used. So how do we build a zero carbon home effectively? And we've got the Future Homes standard coming in very shortly. We've been reducing emissions. There was the building regs changed in 2021, and that reduced emissions by 31%. And now we've got the Future Homes standard, which will effectively fully decarbonise the operation of new homes. So mainly by switching over from gas to electric, and then the grid decarbonises. So that's the sort of story in terms of how the performance of new homes decarbonises. And then the next big question is, how do we decarbonise the materials? So that's and obviously there's a lot of carbon emissions, particularly in materials like cement and concrete and bricks and asphalt and glass and so on. And so what we're looking at is first understanding how to measure that consistently to understand where the carbon is, and then how do we drive it out. So we've got, as the Future Homes Hub, we're agreeing with the sector a sectoral decarbonisation plan, which effectively sort of works out how the whole sector decarbonises. And so we are looking, as you say, at all of those materials, both in terms of how the house is designed, how you can use alternative materials, but also how we work with those other materials sectors to drive down emissions in those sectors.
Yeah, this is an interesting area as well, isn't it, Ed? Is that it sort of strikes me like in some areas, like things like modular construction, which is pretty standard in many parts of the world, particularly in European continental European countries, the UK has been really quite slow to adopt modular construction at scale, with some people arguing that that means so this is essentially making homes in factories and transporting and bolting them together like Lego blocks on site. The argument being that that can be quicker and that they're better insulated and cheaper and all of those kind of things. Do you think we need to kind of catch up a bit on that, or is that just a perception?
So I think absolutely, if we're going to build anything like 1.5 million homes, then factory production is the way we need to move. Particularly if you think of the challenges over workforce and skills and that kind of thing. So actually sort of manufacturing homes, building in factories is really important. But we also then need to look at the policy framework at the same time. So in order to be able to build homes in factories, we need standardization in terms of the rules. We need to have consistent national standards that explain what a zero carbon home looks like. So one of the features we've had over previous years is every local authority setting different standards. And that's perfectly understandable because we didn't have national standards rising over the last 10 or 15 years. Then local authorities, having declared climate emergencies, have set their own standards, but that makes it very difficult, for example, to build in factories. So talking to local authorities, actually they'd much rather have a national standard that they can work to. And it's the kind of thing that will enable us to build in factories where it's been much harder in recent years.
So why haven't we had that? I mean, we've been talking about homes. House building has been absolutely at the forefront of the political agenda for at least a decade or so. Why is it, and lots of successive governments promised to move on it, why is it that we still don't have those kind of common standards? Well, we did have them at one point, didn't we? Had a green home standard, and then the coalition government got rid of it. So is it perhaps all these chopping and changing of standards that's caused a lot of confusion?
Absolutely, and it serves no one's purpose to chop and change for builders, and particularly the supply chain, when standards change and you don't know what's going to happen next. So think of all of the products that we need to have at scale. No one's going to invest in factories and products if they don't know whether the standard's going to come in. So one of the things, I think I was sort of reflecting back on Sarah Jane's sort of all of the different sort of balls we need to juggle or whatever, the knitting we need to do. And for me, all of this is possible, but we need a consistent, certain, long-term timetable. We need absolutely, as Sarah Jane says, to be, sitting down together, working out what that long-term plan is. And we need to be working with government to stick to a long-term plan that enables us to do all of these things together. While it's possible to do all of that, it's not possible to do it overnight for lots of different reasons, in terms of the timescales, in terms of buying land, getting planning permission, designing different house types or whatever. So it takes time to adjust, but then you need a clear and certain timetable to be able to do all of these things.
Thank you, Ed. And by the way, I should say, Diana Davidson, thank you very much for your comment about modular homes, which started me off on that particular point, which is something I've as someone that lived in Canada a long time ago, about 30 years ago, modular homes were pretty standard then, and it's amazing that we sort of still seem to think of them as a new, strange thing here in the UK. So many more comments and questions coming in. Let's just talk a little bit about on-site energy. Polly has said, if there was legislation to acquire new supermarkets, warehouses, etc., to have solar panels fitted, and encouragement with grants to retrofit existing ones, huge amounts of energy could be provided. I know we're talking tonight about solving the whole housing crisis, but it would be a real missed opportunity to build new homes that don't have either solar roofs or green roofs on them, wouldn't it? Sarah Jane, I see you nodding vigorously.
Yeah, and that absolutely, Craig, and that's part of the challenge. I couldn't agree more with what Ed said. What we need is a consistent long-term plan here. And I was talking to one of our local developers recently. We need to work really proactively with our developers who are trying to move their development work in the right direction. And one of them that I spoke to recently said, actually, energy was one of his biggest concerns with any of the new developments that he created. And partly, again, there's a system here that is locking us into the old-fashioned, more difficult energy systems, rather than encouraging the use of solar panels and of local energy networks within the development, which are much harder to get through from his perspective. Actually, that's one of those examples where if we were to change the system that we currently have in place, those developers who do want to be a bit more innovative, who do want to think about how they create good quality energy, renewable energy sources within their developments, would be supported, rather than at the moment perhaps feeling that they're sticking their necks out to do something which long term will be really beneficial for us, but in the short term is actually much, much harder to achieve. So part of the job of getting us all in a room together is, how do we solve some of those system challenges and change them so that it's not such hard work to kind of do the right thing?
Absolutely. And Venus, obviously it's crucially important to get people into social homes and so on, but obviously cost of living is a challenge, and the better insulated a house is, the lower people's energy bills will be. This must be a huge concern to Shelter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, 25% of private renters are struggling. People are making that decision between, paying their rent or turning on the heating, and people well-being is at risk. So it's definitely something that that needs to be thought about, especially when we're thinking about new builds, of how operational, what's going to happen. Even with climate change, with even hotter summers, right? And are these homes going to provide shelter in really, really hot weather that's coming on board? So I think it's both, right? It's the insulation and making sure these homes are protected from damp and mold and the other issues that we're constantly seeing, both in the private sector as well as the social housing sector. But what comes next, and how do we make sure we're building homes fit for the future, and challenges even now? Yeah.
So avoiding damp and mold, making sure they don't leak heat, but equally don't overheat in summer by having big walls of glass facing south.
Yeah, absolutely. To the point on MMCs, I think there's a real massive opportunity there. I think that
MMCs being, so MMCs is
the modular homes, modern methods of construction, modular homes. I think obviously the industry has seen some difficulties with some shutting down and obviously ceasing to exist. But I think if the government did invest in a mass scale building program for social homes, that it does have a role. It can have a role to actually build at pace, but also to meet sustainability requirements and other things that we know are needed for homes. So I think there's an industry and a green technology potential there that the government should tap into.
Absolutely.
Can I come back on a couple of?
Yeah, go on, Ed.
Back on a couple. So one is this sort of question about solar and on-site generation, and so I think we will see a lot more solar coming through in the next years. So the regulations changed in 2021. Some of that, there's a bit of a time lag, a transition period in terms of when building actually happens. So we will see from that a lot more solar coming through. And then once the Future Homes Standard is in, which we're expecting it to be published this year, and then a 2-year transition timeline, we'll see fully electric homes with solar PV, with heat pumps and so forth. So that's all coming through. We've also had a change in the technical term is Part O of the building regs, which addresses overheating. So we'll have homes that are much more resilient to the hottest days in summer and are much more livable from that perspective. So there's a lot that's coming through at the moment. And then the other one I think is just around modular. And there's a question about how much is done off-site in factories versus. So I think there's probably not a trend towards fully modular transporting the whole home, but there's a lot of sort of the panels being manufactured and sometimes smart roofs and things like this. So there's a question in terms of almost what's the perfect recipe for how much should be done off-site and how much should be done on-site. But a lot of the larger companies are now investing in factories to manufacture quite a bit of the panels, insulation, that kind of thing in factories.
Can I come in on the on-site energy point
please do, Ada.
as well? So I think one limitation of installing, there's been quite a lot of campaigning going on around, say, all new homes should have solar panels, for example. I think the intention is definitely good, but then at the same time, the way our current system works is that we rely on quite a lot of the private market to provide public goods. What that means is that if there's a development coming through, then there will be agreement between the developer and the local planning authority that, say, the developer must provide X% of affordable housing alongside all the other houses that they're going to sell. And so what it means is that the developer is using a proportion of the profit to provide that public good. Now, in recent years, there have been quite a lot of different things that we are trying to pile onto this sort of requirement for developers. And that raises the question of viability. So it's sort of like, I'm not saying that like affordable housing and energy and climate should be in conflict, but then the way our current system works means that if we start to require developers to have solar on housing, it could mean that they will have less profit to deliver affordable housing. So it's something that like we sort of need to work through, just because of how our current system works and the reliance on the private market to provide for social good. And this is something that, is it like super ideal? Probably not, but is it something that we can change in the short term? Probably not as well.
Okay, Ada, thank you very much. Now, Sarah Jane, there's a couple of questions about biodiversity net gain. I think you and I, between us, make sure we have to deal with. We had a question from John Waters that says, I suspect BNG will give the government the excuse they've been looking for to build on wildlife-rich sites. Another question, how does BNG ensure that developers retain as much established habitat as possible? We need to talk about mitigation hierarchy, don't we, Sarah Jane?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And biodiversity net gain is obviously predicated on the fact that the mitigation hierarchy is observed. So it's not trying to supersede the mitigation hierarchy. In other words,
and what is it? Tell us what the mitigation hierarchy.
When any development takes place, the developer has to think about that development from the perspective of making sure that they avoid as much damage as they possibly can in the first instance. When they've identified residual damage, if you like, that is unavoidable, they then have to both compensate for that and mitigate against that as much as they possibly can. That's what we mean by the mitigation hierarchy. And only when they've gone through that process do you then look at the biodiversity net gain aspect of what happens. They will then look at biodiversity net gain both on-site and off-site. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why in Surrey we've really pushed a 20% biodiversity net gain minimum is because in many cases 10% can be achieved on site, which is fantastic because it will lead to better quality, greener places that are built for people. But if we do want to do that bit extra around local nature recovery, then actually going a bit further and looking at 20% allows you to do that. So when a developer is looking at a site as well, because of the way in which the biodiversity net gain metric, the statutory metric, has been devised, it means that there is in effect a level playing field in terms of how those sites are assessed. It also looks at the baseline for that site so that you know what was there on the site before the development or the planning permission was put forward. So it should ensure that there is greater protection around not damaging sites or using a baseline where damage has already occurred, and therefore the biodiversity net gain available is greater than it should have been. So there are protections built in to the way that the metric performs, if you like. Now, nothing is perfect, and there are teething things that need to be worked through in terms of how that work comes forward. Nonetheless, the metric does give us the opportunity to have much greater clarity over what damage is being done and how it is being put back, if you like, from the biodiversity net gain perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And just for the avoidance of any doubt, there, of course, as the Wildlife Trust, we do strongly believe that there are some sites you should never go near in any circumstances. So designated sites like sites of special scientific interest, special areas of conservation, any of those under the Habitats Directive, and some habitats like ancient woodland, of course, for example, and a lot of peat bogs. You can't damage those and then create them somewhere elsewhere. Ancient woodland takes hundreds of years to create. So this is absolutely not in any way. Biodiversity net gain is when you've got the absolute protection in place for the most important wildlife sites. This is about what happens elsewhere. So just for the avoidance of any doubt there. I want to come back to you, Venus, if I can, about a little bit more about talking about where these, as you were saying, 90,000 social rental homes are needed. Because there's quite a lot of debate at the moment whether it's brownfield land, green belt. Are we talking in the middle of our towns and cities, on the outskirts, in rural areas? What's your sense at Shelter as to where these are needed, and also in different regions of the country as well? Is it everywhere? Are we particularly talking about acute need in the southeast or elsewhere? Give us a bit of a sense of that.
Yeah, so just to say immediately off the bat that homelessness is rising everywhere. It is not just an urban and city thing. There is also rural homelessness. There's hidden homelessness in smaller villages and towns as well. So the idea that this is just happening in places like London or Manchester or Birmingham is I think a very it's just very wrong to think about it in that way. So yes, brownfields should be first where it can happen. Obviously, as Ada just said, there's always viability problems that we always hear about with building on brownfields, cleanup, remediation, etc. And so again, I think this is where the government needs to come in and support, brownfield sites to be developed on, because we know that there are challenges there. Yes, of course, we want to protect green space and we want to make sure that there are parts of the green belt that are not built on. However, there are parts of the green belt. I wish definitions could potentially change and be a lot more clearer about what's what. We know there are sites like derelict petrol stations having complete, pieces of land that could be developed on, that is identified or categorized as green belt that could be built on, that have essentially no environmental value to them. They're not heritage sites. They're just spots that have been caught in a particular boundary and now have been identified as green belt. So there are areas that we do think can be built on both. So quite frankly, I think there needs to be a national land strategy that needs to come out of this to figure out where the homes need to be built. Obviously looking at need, of course, everybody will say, well, London has the greatest need, so let all the homes go there. But strategically, does that make sense? No. And we know that also will not solve the homelessness crisis that we're seeing everywhere and the housing emergency that we're seeing throughout the country as well.
Okay, thanks, Venus. Yeah, quite a lot in all of that. So there is obviously a need for these new social rental homes right across the country in all of these kind of circumstances. And I'll just make a quick comment. I mean, this comment about sort of derelict petrol stations in Greenbelt being made a few times I've heard before now, and I think people can understand that there's areas like that that don't necessarily fit under what would often be considered the Greenbelt mold. What I would say is that even a derelict petrol station sometimes might still have important bits of nature in it. I know a bee specialist that found some amazing, very rare species of bees in, guess what, a derelict petrol station a few years back. Now, that doesn't mean you can't build there, but it means mitigation work needs to be done beforehand. So, and again, in some of these areas, they might just have a very mature oak tree, which actually you'd hope that a development could build around it. And then you've got a oak tree at the centerpiece of a development. And
yeah,
so,
absolutely. I think there are mitigations that you can definitely take into account for both things, right? To making sure that you are respecting whatever is valuable of nature there, but also making sure that if you can build, as for social rent specifically, that's what we're calling for, that you can do that. But again, this is why I think there's something on land and a strategy and a more holistic way that we approach these things kind of need to happen, which hasn't really been done yet. So it'd be interesting to see if there was a great national database where where are sites, what's there, what's not there. At the moment, it's kind of a hit or miss. You're relying on local authorities to have either the resources to know exactly where these places are that should or can't be built on. And so, yeah, it'd be nice to, there's definitely a data gap there that needs to be addressed.
Now, we've been talking about this exactly about the need for a land use strategy, and the government announced just a couple of weeks ago that they're now consulting on that and will be producing one, which is something that we, the Wildlife Trust, have been calling for a long time. And of course, it also points to another issue that's been coming in quite a lot of discussions tonight. I'll sum this up. There's one comment from Karen, says it's all well and good talking about eco houses, how eco houses will be. They are still being built on good farmland, and we've had quite a lot of comments tonight about the taking of farmland to build new housing. Sarah Jane, can I come to you, because we hear this a lot. We don't just hear it about building new houses, do it? Sometimes we hear that even when we're trying to create a new space for nature, that's taking land out of food production. There's a very strong narrative at the moment, isn't it, that all we need to do is use land to grow food. I mean, do you just want to take that on a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's a little bit like the conversation that where we started in terms of trying to create a binary discussion around land use. It must be used just for food production, or it must be used only for nature. And of course, the reality is that good food production and efficient food production benefits from a healthy natural environment within which it operates, because they are dynamic systems. They are not separate artificial systems. So we can't produce food effectively if we don't have healthy soils, and if we don't have a good population of pollinators, for example. If we don't have a healthy natural environment, we have to make a lot more artificial interventions to produce food. And so it's not a binary discussion. We can produce food on land with a healthy natural environment. And if we really think about it, we can create places where people can actually live around that environment of producing food. They can also have good quality jobs. So these things are not separate. We live in a complex system, and the challenge that we have at the moment is to stop thinking about isolated outcomes and to think about how we create a healthy and effective society for all of us with healthy nature, healthy places to live. So I don't think that dichotomy between one or the other is a helpful way for us to solve that challenge.
Yeah, quite. I often think, people like to talk about we need to balance producing food with building new houses, or balance producing food with nature, and that all sounds nice, but I actually think the word balance is misleading, because it actually poses immediately these things on the opposite side of the pivot, and really what we need to do is integrate how we can build housing and create new space for nature and grow good quality food and have a more sustainable and equitable and just food system, actually, at the macro level, is indeed in just thinking about the land we need for food. Well, we've almost run out of time, I'm afraid. I want to come to each of you just for a minute each to give us your sum up answer for the night, if I can. I'll remind you that the overall question we had tonight is, how can you build 1.5 million homes and solve the climate, nature and health crisis? We've had a brilliant conversation tonight, and thank you so much. And how do you what is your final closing words on how to do that? Maybe, can I come to you first, please, Ed? Oh, you're on mute, Ed, sorry.
So borrowing others' language, I think we need to sit around the table and work together to come up with a long-term plan to knit all of these things together, to integrate all of these things in a way that all parties, whether it's Shelter, the Wildlife Trust, home builders, that works for everyone. So I think we need one long-term plan that does all of that together.
Thank you very much. That sounds like a need for lots of planners. Ada, your final summary conclusion, please.
Yep. So I definitely agree with other panelists on the positivity around the land use conversation. We are very supportive of the land use consultation at the moment, and looking more broadly, we're also expecting a national spatial plan on energy, and also there will be announcements on the location of new towns. So it is really about achieving multifunctionality of land. And to do that, like, it is really positive that now we have got these national debates on national land use, not only for agriculture, but energy and housing as well. So I would say the next step, in order for us to achieve this target of 1.5 million homes, while at the same time protecting nature, promoting healthy lifestyle, etc., what we need is better integration between all these different strategies and national spatial plans, so that we can actually use land more effectively to achieve all the goals that we are hoping to achieve.
Brilliant, Ada. Thank you very much. Venus, last words from you as policy at Shelter.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a really fantastic conversation. So really for us, the government needs to lead in delivering those 90,000 social rent homes a year that are obviously fit for the future, that are fit for the climate and environmental challenges that we are experiencing and will continue to experience. And without it, it will not meet its target of 1.5 million homes. So hopefully that can be prioritized in the upcoming spending review.
Great, thank you very much. And Sarah Jane, to you for last comment from the panelists tonight.
Thanks very much, Craig. I think we should all go out and seek the people who we think have the most diverse view from our own around all of these topics, and sit together and come up with the solutions for what we're all ultimately interested in, which is improving society and life for all of us, including nature recovery.
Brilliant, Sarah Jane, thank you. And I also want to say I've been sent tonight a link to homesforeveryone.org. This is from the Community Planning Alliance. Do have a look at it. There's some, it's covering a lot of the topics that we were talking about tonight, and you might be interested to see that as well. So have a good look at that. I want to say a huge thank you to our brilliant panel tonight, to Dr. Ada Lee, Policy Specialist at the Royal Town Planning Institute, to Venus Galarza-Mullins, Policy Manager at Shelter, to Sarah Jane Chimbwandira, Chief Executive at Surrey Wildlife Trust, and Ed Lockhart, Chief Executive at Future Homes Hub. You've been a fantastic panel tonight, and we've tried to get through as many questions as we can. Thank you so much to the panel for doing that, and I hope you at home have really enjoyed this and found it a very useful conversation. This is obviously a hot topic, will continue to be so for many years yet, but I hope we've managed to shed a bit of light on it tonight. Our next Wildlife will be on March the 18th, and it's a hybrid event. It's from the University of Hull, so you can come along in person if you live near Hull or want to travel to Hull, and that's on the 18th of March, and it's entitled "Could Nature Be Our Best Flood Defence?" So that's really looking at the role nature can play in helping tackle flooding. Of course, we're holding in Hull because Hull did suffer appalling flooding a few years ago. Many homes flooded out a few years ago, and so there's a lot of research going on in Hull around this, and particularly the role that nature can play in protecting people's homes from flooding. So do click on the link in the YouTube chat now to register. Do come along in person if you're in Hull. We'd love to see you, and we really love those hybrid events where there's a live audience and an online audience as well. We'll be bringing you regular wildlife throughout 2025. We've got many really exciting ones planned, and some great guests lined up. So keep an eye on the Wildlife Trust social media and sign up for our events newsletter for the latest to make sure you don't miss next Wildlife. And of course, if you miss it going out live, yeah, you won't be able to comment or as you go along, but you can still watch them. And we have a big back catalogue of Wildlives now over the last 4 or 5 years that we've been doing this now, across a huge range of topics, with some brilliant panelists over the time that you can go back and look at on your leisure. So anyway, thanks again to our wonderful panelists tonight for joining us. Thank you for joining us at home as well. Hope you found it useful. And until the next Wildlife, good night, goodbye.